One can build a shelter from the bricks and stone, but you can make it something better. Take your hustle home. We can do together. Right? It's impossible alone. Yes, we got so much waiting there for us. It's obvious you and me. It's better when it's we.
All right, howdy Ags. Welcome back to Biomechanics, the Torque Edition, second or third Torque Edition. I think we're on like the third Torque Edition. So it's going to be about applications. Indeed, as they were just singing, it's better off if it's we. So if you're wondering what I'm playing, this is Mama's Gun. There's a guy named Andy Platts who is like the lead singer, multi-instrumentalist, and he's the major songwriter. He's also a major songwriter, singer for a group named Young Gun, Silver Fox. So check him out and check those groups out. Mama's Gun, it's named after a song by Erykah Badu, by the way, called Mama's Gun. Great song. It's a great group. He's an incredibly talented songwriter, combines that old school and new school stuff. Really amazing. Okay, back to biomechanics. So today we're going to be focusing on applications relating to joint mechanics. So we've been going through lever systems and hopefully understanding how skeletal muscle forces get produced into torque as well as outside resistances. Today we're going to talk about and isolate skeletal muscles and talk about their ability to produce rotation, producing torque, and also their ability to cause stabilization. So it's going to be all about resolving those muscle force vectors. So one of the concepts I think is really important is that the ability to produce torque and to produce stabilization changes throughout the range of motion. It also changes with intensity, meaning as we're trying to lift a heavier weight, a number of things change, including addition of co-contraction, or the amount of co-contraction actually enhances. And while you think that might, well, maybe that should help net torque, well, it actually reduces net torque, but the trade-off is protection of joints and bones. Okay, so the point is, what happens to muscle tension when we are contracting, especially agonist muscles? Well, some of it, again, is going to go towards producing rotation. Some of it's going to go towards producing stabilization, and it's going to change, as we go throughout the range of motion. So these two components, so sometimes in biomechanics there's a trade-off. Sometimes you get to have your cake and eat it too. This is a case where most of the time we get to have our cake and eat it too. There are a few exceptions, and we're going to talk about those briefly and when they can be a real danger in terms of joint injuries, etc. So when muscles contract, we can actually resolve, meaning divide the force component in the two perpendicular parts into the part that produces joint movement. That's called a rotary part. And the part that can, but not always, contribute to joint stability, that's the stabilization part. As long as that component of the muscle vector, that resolved muscle component, points toward or through the joint, it actually presses the joints together and enhances their stability. So the amount that goes to torque and or stability depends upon the muscle group. Some muscle groups, like the biceps brachii, you can get to a point where you'll actually have almost all of the force goes towards producing torque, and then an extreme flexion, some of the force actually could potentially cause tension at the joint. So I'll show you when we resolve muscle vectors how that actually happens. Other muscle joint groups, like for example, knee extensors, they're going to produce large stabilizing forces all the way through the range of motion, which makes a lot of sense. The human knee, for example, is potentially a really bad site of a major injury. If you have a major knee injury, for humans, it's really tough to get around because we ambulate, we walk and we run. The knee joint is more susceptible for a number of reasons. Doesn't have quite as much muscle mass around it as the hip joint. And it's also in an exposed part of the body. So it can get blows from the side, from the front, from the back. Those are the types of things that can cause a lot of problems. Usually with an ankle injury, it's because it turns or we roll it over rather than an impact force directly on the ankle. Those can happen, but they're a bit unusual. The shoulder is also susceptible. So because of ankle turns, especially the lateral side of the ankle, the knee, the shoulder, these are joints that are susceptible to potential injuries. Okay, so the amount that goes to torque and or stability changes again with a muscle group, joint angle, muscle length, speed of stretch. All of these things make a difference in terms of how much force and how much torque is being produced, and then how much of it can potentially go towards stabilization. So keep in mind those co-contractions are incredibly important with stabilization. Okay, so we're going to redefine some terms. Line of pull, this is where your anatomy comes in. Remember origins and insertions? Yeah, you'll never use those. Yes, you do. Here's a place where we're going to actually use them, because notice this muscle force vector for the elbow flexor group. So this would be the biceps brachii, the brachialis, the brachioradialis. So the force goes from the insertion of, we'll just say this is the biceps brachii tendon, onto the radius, and it's going to pull through the middle of the muscle, through the middle of the biceps brachii, through its tendon up towards the shoulder. It's going to actually attach onto the scapula. So this is our line of pull. This is where the muscle force is acting. We have some distance. We call this a force arm, remember? And this would be for holding a weight. This would be a third-class lever. So we have the force in the middle. We have the axis of rotation, the fulcrum on one side. We have the resistance on the other side. Even if it's just the weight of the forearm, that's going to have a center of mass about right here. So the resistance arm is going to be a lot longer than the force arm regardless. That means we have a third-class lever. And we probably have a force arm to resistance arm ratio of anywhere between 1:5 to 1:10, depending upon how you're shaped and how heavy the object you're lifting is, or the amount of force that's being produced on the hand. It could be maybe you're holding a baseball bat or a tennis racket, etc. So this is the line of pull. This is our axis of rotation. The distance between the axis of rotation or middle of the joint and where the insertion is, that technically is the force arm. That's our lever arm. The longer this is, the greater the amount of torque this muscle could produce. So with some people, in different mammals, you have different insertion places, which can alter the amount of torque that's being produced. So there's our line of pull. In order to resolve this vector, we need the angle between the lever, so that would be the forearm. We can basically draw it down the bone to the hand, and the line of pull. So that's the next thing we'll talk about. That's the angle of pull. That's the orientation between the muscle force vector, excuse me, and then the angle of pull. So we draw the angle of pull usually towards the joint instead of away from the joint. If this muscle force is kind of pointing towards the joint and this angle of pull, or alpha, is less than 90 degrees or perpendicular, that means when we resolve this force vector, we're going to have a significant stabilizing component that points towards or through the joint. That's providing true stabilization by enhancing compressive forces of the bones together and taking advantage of the articular and, in many cases, the fibrocartilage that's in the joint. The elbow doesn't have a lot of fibrocartilage. Okay, let's click on the right thing here, or maybe I'll need to just go down. There we go. So we would resolve, let's say, the force vector. Here we have our muscle force, our rotary component, our stabilized component. We can see those two roles. Remember, the rotary component is going to be drawn perpendicular or at a right angle with the lever system. And then the stabilizing component is going to be drawn alongside the lever system. They're at a 90-degree or right angle with each other. So as we go throughout the range of motion, this relationship is going to change. The angle of pull changes, and as the angle of pull changes, that means the part of that muscle force that goes towards rotation or torque and the part that goes towards stabilization is going to change. So magnitude, direction, they're really important. So I want to show you what you're starting to notice is that we're going to be drawing stick figures to represent what's going on in muscle joint system. So we're going to look at a really important particular system, and that's the elbow flexors, and that's the knee extensors, and we're going to talk about the patella in just a moment. Okay, so when we're translating tension into torque, we're going to talk about a very important muscle joint system, and this is the quadriceps muscle as it's pulling through the patella into the patella tendon. So between the quadriceps and the patella, there's something called the patella tendon. Quite a few years ago, Charles Barkley actually tore this during his last season of the NBA, didn't really recover from it. I think they lost to the Bulls anyway. I think he was playing for the Houston Rockets that year. And they had won 2 NBA championships a few years before that, and were trying to come back for their 3rd. And Michael Jordan was playing, and I think after Charles Barkley tore that ligament, I think that was kind of the end of the line for that Rocket dynasty or mini dynasty while Michael Jordan was playing baseball. Okay, so what the patella acts as a pulley. So what does that mean? Pulley is a simple machine that changes the direction of a force. So we're changing the direction of the quadriceps force, moving it around. So now the force vector looks something like this. What it's actually doing is enhancing the angle of pull for the knee extensor muscles, for the quadriceps. It actually makes it a little bit larger. In like a dog or a cat, this patella is really small. It doesn't act like much of a pulley. The knee is really there to act like a spring, and it's kind of stable. A lot of the push off for a cat or a dog is in hip extension and then plantar flexion of their ankle. Remember, their ankle's way back there. They actually have a long foot. Dogs and cats run on their toes. Even elephants, as you know, run on their toes. So the patella simply changes the direction of that force vector and allows that rotary force actually to grow larger so you can produce some torque. Now you probably notice this angle of pull is going to be pretty small. It looks like it'll be about 25 degrees. So the stabilized component points through the joint, and you can see it's really long, much larger than the rotary component. And that's pretty much what you see. So if you're doing a knee extension exercise, and let's say that you're extending, I'm going to make it 50 pounds with one leg. So if you're extending the knee with 50 pounds, you probably have about an 8-to-1 ratio between the resistance arm and the force arm, meaning the mechanical advantage is 1-to-8. So if we multiply 8 by 50, that's about 400 pounds at an angle of pull of 20 degrees. That muscle force is probably going to be about 700 pounds. So it wouldn't be unusual if you're doing like a squat with a really large weight, or if you're doing knee extension with 100 pounds, 150 pounds. You're looking at 1,000 pounds plus of force produced by the quadriceps. So it's not unusual in your body to have muscles producing forces of half a ton or more. So you think, wow, how do your tissues take that? Because we've been talking about when people land, there's a lot of force. It's 2 to 3 times, even maybe 3.5 times your body weight. So 400, 500, 600 pounds plus. But you get that in the body with these major muscles contracting when you're lifting weights or pushing off, or maybe do the high jump or long jump, or you have to give that big burst of force and power. So really large forces, much of that force is going to go towards stabilization You also probably have a co-contraction. If this is the quadriceps, I can say that the hamstrings is contracting almost all the time at the same time, because it also contributes to hip extension. And if you're extending the knee, you probably either extended the hip prior to that or at the same time. So that means the quadriceps, the hamstrings are almost always engaged in a co-contraction. And if you're running, walking, doing exercises that involve locomotion and movement, you're probably contracting the gastrocnemius, plantar flexor muscles. And that muscle also crosses the knee. So that means the hamstrings, the gastrocnemius, the quadriceps are pretty much contracting all the time in, I would almost call this like a triangulation co-contraction. It's like a tri-contraction. So when you have these major muscles contracting at the same time, they're helping to keep the knee together. Sure, the ACL is incredibly important. Sure, so is the MCL, PCL, the lateral collateral ligament. You can't run and walk without them, but you really need those muscles. And this hits home why muscle strength is so important in terms of maintenance and part of the rehabilitation after a knee joint injury. Because when one of the or more of the ligaments has failed or has been injured, has lost some of its material or mechanical properties, its strength and stiffness and toughness, that means you're even more dependent on those muscles to stabilize joints like the knee, elbow, shoulder, etc. Okay, so if we resolve this vector, let's say we have a 24-degree angle, which isn't unusual. If we resolve that muscle force vector into rotary and stabilized components, and we can construct a right triangle, remember, by just moving the rotary component over. There we go. And now that we have a right triangle, that means I'm going to move the muscle force over here and the rotary force, excuse me, over there. The rotary force is opposite theta, so that means the sine of theta is going to be equal to the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. The muscle force will always be the hypotenuse in these types of problems. So the rotary component is equal to the muscle force times the sine of 24 degrees. And the stabilizing force is therefore the muscle force times the cosine of 24 degrees. There we go. So the next step, let's say that muscle force is 300 newtons. We'll multiply 300 newtons times the sine of 24 degrees. That's 122.02 newtons. A person's body weight typically might be 500, 600, 700 newtons to give you an idea. So the stabilizing force, notice, is much larger, over twice as large, 274.06 newtons by multiplying 300 times the cosine of 24 degrees. So again, remember, as the angle of pull changes, that means the rotary component and the stabilized component also change. Let's say that's a constant amount of muscle force. That actually doesn't happen either, because as you go through the range of motion, as you get closer to full extension with a biceps brachii, as you stretch a muscle, it can produce more force. So the closer you get to one of the ends of the range of motion where a muscle is stretched, it produces more force. You get to the other end, full flexion, that muscle is shortened. It actually can't produce as much force because there's not as much overlap, or it's not as many cross bridges available between actin and myosin. The overlap is not optimal between the thick and thin filaments. So that means torque production and stability changes. So there's kind of a rule of thumb. As we go throughout the range of motion, this is generally what we see. Now, in different muscle joint systems, the peak rotary component and the peak torque can be closer to one end, like flexion, or closer to the other end, like extension or abduction, etc. So this curve's a little different for each muscle joint group, but this is the general rule of thumb. Somewhere in the middle, like an elbow joint angle of about 80, 85 degrees. For the knee joint, it's about 105 or so. That's where we can produce the greatest amount of torque. We've stretched the muscles part way. We've optimized the rotary component by getting that angle of pull as close to 90 degrees as possible. And that means we're maximizing torque. On each end of the range of motion, the emphasis is a bit more towards stabilization, especially when you have a co-contraction, So let's look at actually some real data. Here we go. This is from the Journal of Biomechanics quite a while ago. This is mechanical advantage. This would correspond with the magnitude of the rotary force, which is also going to mean how much torque was developed. Sometimes in biomechanics, in the kinesiology realm, you see some strange units being used. It's also true for exercise physiology. I'll try to translate when I can into what they really meant and what the standard units might be. As an engineer, this stuff kind of drives me nuts, frankly. Units are a big thing. So as I was saying, it's almost 20 years ago now, where there was a Mars probe that was supposed to land, but the parachute deployed 50 miles underneath the surface as opposed to 50 miles above the surface. And that was actually due to a units problem, believe it or not, in the calculations. Yeah, $2 billion down the drain right there. So here's the important thing here. Look at this elbow joint angle, about 80, 85 degrees. That's where the peak is. As we get closer to full extension, notice this would be our ability to produce torque. It's tanking. What the heck's going on here? Don't you want some torque? You probably do, but there's a couple of good things, especially when your arms are down by your side and you're lifting an object. There we go, got a convenient femur. When your elbow is extended like that, most of the weight is just pulling on the elbow. You actually don't have to produce a lot of torque because the moment arm is incredibly small. As I lift more and more, that moment arm gets larger and larger. And guess what? This is where I can produce the greatest amount of torque right there. That's not a coincidence. Where you need it. And so when people are like lifting an object, so this is a trash can. When people are lifting an object, whether it's a trash can full of trash or a bag of groceries, or for our ancestors, they're bringing back fruits, nuts, harvest, game, etc. Whatever they needed to bring back meat. Carrying, we're going to put our muscles and joints in a position where they can produce the greatest amount of torque. And that's kind of, with your shoulders, it's about like this. And with your elbows, it's about that 85-degree angle. So when you're carrying stuff like this is kind of optimal. So when you're carrying something, you're going to probably put your body in this type of position. So for abduction of the shoulder and for flexion, muscles that we use in terms of carrying that produce those types of movements, we get that optimal joint angle. This is also true when you're starting to run or jump. This is degrees into the range of motion, so it's a little confusing. This would be equivalent to the knee joint angle of about 105 degrees or so. So a little over 90 degrees. So maybe 110 or so. So that means that we're partially flexed, but not halfway there. Again, weird units. This is from, I think, some data from the late 1980s, kilogram meters. It should be Newton meters. Kilograms are units of mass. So it's like baking a cake with just eggs. That's an omelet. But even with an omelet, you got to put like peppers and onions and other stuff in there, some hot sauce, top it off with. Okay, so notice these sprinters. They get into a position, whether it's at the start or during the race, where they have that knee flexion. And they can produce that optimal joint angle that will increase the amount of torque that they can produce. So here we go. It's all about maxing out the torque, whether it's hip extension, knee extension. Actually, for plantar flexion, that's kind of optimal right there. That's an ankle joint angle of about 90 to about 100 degrees. That's where you could produce the greatest amount of torque for the plantar flexor muscles. So that's what sometimes you're trying to max out in torque. It could be jumping up for a rebound in basketball, a spike in volleyball, etc. Maybe you're going to shoot a jump shot. We have a lot of things going on that are going to enhance our performance. So by partially flexing, we don't want to use the word bend in our class, because a bending force, here's our Sieg Adams text. Uh-oh, that's a bending force. Okay, you don't want this at your knee. You don't want this on your head or your neck or your spine. That's a really bad thing, because it's a combination of tension on the top and compression on the bottom. It's a combination load, if you will. Okay, so they're going to rotate. That means we're going to flex partially the hips and knees, put them in a position. This is a really good position. For the hip joint, that's going to be a little under 90 degrees. For the knee joint, we're getting close to that 100, 105, 110 degrees. So by flexing the hips and knees, a few things happen. That actually starts to stretch the muscles that are going to be used in the jump. So that would be the quadriceps, the hip extensors, the gluteus maximus, and the hamstrings are going to be stretched. We're also right here, we'll be stretching the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles. They're getting prepared. When we stretch a muscle, we increase the number of cross bridges between actin and myosin that are going to be available. We also increase the amount of calcium that's being released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We're also activating the stretch reflex. All of those increase active tension. We also have some material properties. So like a rubber band, you stretch a muscle and then it's going to bounce back. So that stretch is actually going to help maximize force. If we maximize force, we're going to maximize torque. These joint angles also are going to maximize the rotary component of the quadriceps, of the gastrocnemius, of the gluteus maximus, of the hamstrings, to be able to produce that hip extension, knee extension, plantar flexion that we're going to be used in the movement itself. So we're maxing out the system in terms of performance. We're also, since we have co-contractions going on at all of these major joints, hip, knees, and ankle, we're also still protecting those joints as well. So the closer the angle of pull is to 90 degrees, the greater the rotary component. If we go from a angle of pull of, let's say, 45, 50 degrees to 90 degrees, we're going to increase torque. This happens in the middle of the range of motion for elbow flexion. Sometimes the angle of pull is going to be less than 90 degrees. In fact, most of the time that's true. So that means we have a stabilizing force that points through the joint, providing compression. The smaller alpha is, the greater the amount of stabilization that occurs for a given amount of force. There are a few exceptions when the angle of pull, there we go, should be that. There we go. When the angle of pull is greater than 90 degrees. There aren't too many situations where this occurs, but I'm going to give you a few examples. The biceps brachii, closer to full flexion. The gastrocnemius, closer to full plantar flexion. And then the hamstrings with extreme knee flexion. Most of the time, it's actually not that big a deal, except when it comes to the knee joint and a few times with the elbow. So let's talk about that. So let's say the angle of pull is, this looks to me like about 120 degrees. When we resolve that force vector, the quote unquote stabilized component is now pointing away from the joint. That means it's producing tension instead of compression. That could be a dislocating force. The good news is usually when this happens, you have a co-contraction, and you may have some circumstances that reduce the risk of an injury occurring. So let's talk about an example. When we have close to full elbow flexion, something really interesting happens when that angle of pull gets really small. So as that angle of pull gets small, as the joint angle gets small, the angle of pull gets large. Sorry, there's an inverse relationship in this case. That angle of pull gets large. So here it's over about 120 degrees. And when that's the case, you got the stabilizing components pointing away from the joint. You can figure out the angle that's on the inside of this triangle, because I've moved the rotary component, by taking 180 degrees, subtracting from that alpha. So it's the complementary angle. There's a number of ways you could actually have moved the stabilized component. But either way you solve it, just keep in mind what's going on with your triangle to solve for the rotary and stabilized components. Now, the point I'm getting to is that, let's say with a free weight, when you're doing elbow flexion, and that weight is, you're finishing up that elbow flexion exercise. That weight is above the elbow. And this is why it's so important, because that means even though you have this quote unquote stabilizing force that could produce tension, it's usually not that big a deal, because the weight of the barbell or whatever's in your hand, especially if it's heavy, is actually coming down the forearm into the elbow, providing compression. So here we get away with it. If you're doing something like tug of war, you probably heard you're supposed to use your back and mostly your legs, particularly legs. It's hard to use your arms. And when you have a lot of elbow flexion, when you're doing tug of war, you could potentially have a dislocating problem. You can really feel it with the medial collateral ligament in the elbow. So watch out if you're doing something like that. This is one of the reasons when people are like climbing rope, when I used to do it, when I weighed a lot less, when I wrestle, I didn't really try to flex my elbows too much. I would keep them, a little bit more extended and just try to climb the rope. So if you do that, you're probably going to be okay. And again, if the weight's above the elbow, it's actually contributing to stabilization. The same thing is actually true if we think about plantar flexion. That's the next situation. So closer to full plantar flexion, the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles are pulling at an angle of pull that's greater than 90 degrees. And that means we have a stabilizing component that's pointing away from the ankle, providing potentially tension on the ankle. However, it's actually not that big a deal in this case either. That's the good news. Notice that most of the force is going to go towards producing rotation. Most of it's going to go towards producing rotation. So we're maximizing torque. We do have a stabilizing component that's pointing away from the joint. But here again, it's not that big a deal, because your body weight is going to be over the tibio-talar joint, the upper ankle joint, if you will. So we got compression on the ankle. That's not a problem. So again, we're going to be able to get away with it. Remember, our axis of rotation is moved over to the ball of the foot. That is the metatarsophalangeal joints. So for your big toe and for your other toes, that ball of the foot, that's between, again, the metatarsal bones and the phalanges, your toes. Okay, so for the elbow, most of the time, and for the ankle, we're in pretty good shape. However, there's a situation doing a deep knee squat where we really have to be careful. We may need a support. We may need a partner. I used to, when I did a lot of squats, I used to put a chair behind me so I couldn't go down too far if I didn't have a partner there. And it was back in the day, so I didn't have supports on my knee or anything like that. So as we're looking at this problem, here's the knee joint, and we've got a knee joint angle of about, 75 degrees. That means the angle to pull is probably going to be, I would say closer to about 115 or so. So that means that we have a stabilizing component that's pointing away from the knee joint. We don't want that, because attached to the knee are the femur and the tibia, the two longest levers in the body. So that means, first of all, we've got lots of torque. Long levers means lots of torque going on. We also have our body weight acting, but instead of the ankle kind of going straight down and actually helping the ankle out, in this case, the femur is actually going to try to slide over the top of the tibia, producing a large shear force at the knee joint. If you've done a deep knee squat, you felt this, it doesn't feel good. If you think, boy, that could be bad, could be dangerous, you're exactly right. So we got large shear forces, we've got these long levers, lots of torque, and then we have this, really it's a destabilizing force. It's a force producing tension on the knee joint. The good news is when we're doing this deep knee squat, we probably have the gastrocnemius contracting, even though here's the problem. As we flex the knee, that gastrocnemius is probably not lengthening. When the knee extends, then it lengthens, and that's good. It will produce a lot more force. So when the knee's flexed, it doesn't produce as much force, so it can't protect the knee as much. It's a double whammy. The quadriceps are probably also producing a force. That's the good news, helping with a co-contraction. That's critical. But we got lots of problems going on here, and as well as the gastrocnemius. So big, big danger indeed. Okay, we're going to do a problem or two, practice problem. Let's say we have the anterior deltoid muscle. So let's say that I'm producing shoulder flexion and it's contracting with a force of 300 newtons. If the angle of pull is 28 degrees, find the rotary and stabilizing portions. So here's a circumstance where we're just going to resolve this muscle force vector into its two components. We're going to move the rotary component over and construct our right triangle. We've got everything we need using sine and cosine to solve for both the rotary and stabilizing components. So we'll use the sine of 28 degrees to find the rotary component. We multiply both sides by the muscle force, and it doesn't really take too long to crunch those numbers and get about 140.8 newtons. In this case, with a small angle of pull, this is almost always true in the shoulder, you're going to have a significant stabilizing component helping to press the humerus into sorry about that. I thought Trixie might have made away with our bone models. She's gotten a hold of a couple of them. Unfortunately, while I wasn't looking about a month ago, she grabbed a couple because they're bones. She's a dog, so it's going to happen. Got to protect yourself at all times. Okay, so there's the glenoid fossa. Here's the head of the humerus. They're going to fit together pretty nicely. Only a small part of the head of the humerus is in contact with the glenoid fossa. So the shoulder joint isn't inherently that stable. So we really need the muscles around the shoulder. Everything from the deltoid muscles, pectoralis major, latissimus dorsi, rotator cuff muscles, the infraspinatus, teres minor, all of those muscles are going to be incredibly important, including the ones, as I was mentioning, that are on the back side of the scapula. So this is going to fit together. If we're producing flexion, that means they're going to kind of go up like this, and you're going to see some rotation of the shoulder girdle as well. And we're going to see a significant stabilizing component. It's always true because we just have some glenohumeral ligaments that help to keep the shoulder together. We do have a labrum or lip that goes around the outside of the glenoid fossa. That really helps in terms of stabilization, but it's just not enough. You need those muscles. Okay, so again, the significant stabilizing component, we're going to do a problem with the hamstrings group. This is where we have an angle of pull that's greater than 90 degrees. So we've got a 105-degree angle here. Then we're going to calculate the angle on the inside of the triangle after we move the rotary component. So once we set up our right triangle trigonometry, we've got a 75-degree angle. We've got a muscle force of 400 newtons. We're going to find that rotary and stabilized components. So in this case, the rotary component is significantly larger. The stabilized component is now pointing away from the joint. So maybe I should give this something like a negative sign. So it's producing potentially dislocation. So that deep knee squat danger is something we need to be concerned about. Okay, if we want to calculate torque, we can resolve this muscle force vector. Now we're going to take the rotary component and apply it in our next step, which is to multiply by the force arm distance. That's the distance between the axis of rotation and where the insertion of the muscle's tendon is. If we multiply these two together, and assuming they're perpendicular with each other, and the rotary component by definition will be, we've got everything we need to calculate torque. So let's do a problem. We've got the iliopsoas group. It's the iliacus and the psoas muscles together. They're contracting with a force of 800 newtons, and they're producing hip flexion. Hip flexion. Let's say the iliopsoas is inserted about 8 centimeters from the middle of the hip joint. That seems about right. That's just over 3 inches. Find the torque produced by the hip flexors. So given a muscle force of 800 newtons, an angle of pull of 30 degrees, a force arm of 8 centimeters, let's find, first of all, the rotary component, and then the muscle torque. So we'll construct our right triangle. We'll solve for the rotary component using the sine of alpha. And then once we have the rotary component, we can multiply by, this is our lever arm, our force arm distance, and that's going to give us the amount of torque. So we've got 800 times the sine of 30 degrees, that's 400 newtons. We multiply that by 8 centimeters, we convert to Newton meters, and we get 32 Newton meters. That's actually a fair amount of torque. So it's not surprising that with hip flexion, and you need that early during the swing phase when people are running, walking, playing tennis, etc., you're going to get that torque. Okay, we've got a few more applications to look at, and I'm going to switch slide sets. Hold on a second. Okay, howdy. Got some additional real world and sports related applications. We're going to talk very briefly about sprinting, lower back, push-ups. I think there have been more push-ups at A&M than any other university. We have the advantage of having a lot of students. We've also had a requirement for physical activity throughout really the entire 10-year lifespan of Texas A&M. And of course, it's got the core and everything else. Weightlifting, stability. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about Nautilus machines and free weights and that type of stuff, and show you a trick or two. Okay. So lots of applications for torque and lever systems. I'm going to bring back the moment of inertia and think about it in terms of sprinting. So as people start to walk and then walk faster and then start to jog, early in the swing phase, you see more hip flexion and more knee flexion. When we're walking, our knees are fairly extended, fairly straight throughout the gait cycle. We don't have a lot of flexion. We don't, again, want to use the term bending in our class. So bad news if that happens. So what does that do? Well, one of the things that it does is reduces the moment arm. Remember, the moment reduces the moment arm and the moment of inertia. So it actually gets both. How did I do that? Okay. All right. Reduces the moment arm and the moment of inertia. We get two advantages that are actually related. So what does that mean? Well, that means the resistance against flexion decreases. The other thing that's interesting is because when the leg is swinging, it can act as a pendulum. And then when it's planted, it can act like a reverse pendulum. It also means the frequency of this pendulum increases, which makes sense. As you start to run faster and faster, you get more and more hip flexion and knee flexion. The pendulum movement gets shorter. It's like going from a grandfather clock to a cuckoo clock. So, and you can see this high kick right there. I can remember a coach back in the day, this was at East Carolina University, which used to have a really good track team, especially sprinters. A&M's had a great track team for a long time, but especially like the last 10 years is when Pat Henry has been here. We've won a number of national championships. At UTEP, they used to have really good sprinters as well. So I remember this coach used to say, kick yourself in the butt or I'll do it for you. Meaning he wanted that high kick with a lot of knee flexion. What he was trying to do was increase the turnover. Remember when we talked about sprinting to maximize power, one of the ways to do that is not only the torque that you're producing and pushing off of the ground with as much force as possible backwards, but also a high stride rate, high RPMs, if you will. Get that turnover going. So the way you can do that is reducing the moment arm, reducing the moment of inertia, the resistance against torque. So for a given amount of torque, it means more angular acceleration, more angular acceleration. So whether it's the moment arm or the moment of inertia, we're going to have less resistance to actual movement. And again, as I was saying, we're increasing that pendulum frequency. I've done something funky. Okay, so the next application is if you're lifting, if you're moving stuff, how do you want your back to be situated? Human spine is really good at dealing with compressive forces and also torsion or twisting. It's not very good with handling shear forces or bending forces. And so that's why when we're lifting and moving an object, you don't want your spine to be anything but vertical. Once it starts to lean over, when you have a lot of hip flexion, there are a number of issues that happen. You get a greater shear force. Look, there it is. Shear force acting on the spine, cutting across the spine, that could cause lower back injury. This happens usually when this is repeated, when people are lifting. I used to work on a farm way back in the day during the summer, doing a number of things. And if we were carrying something or moving something, and back then I weighed a lot less than I do now. So much lighter weight class for wrestling. So I used to put an object next to my, I would say hip, but iliac crest, next to the pelvis. So what I had figured out, without doing the math, what I figured out is if I had something heavy and I moved it in here and straightened out my spine, it was easier to move. I didn't get as tired. The reason being is that each of these objects, this, let's say, heavy box, and this person's arm, and their head, and their torso, they're some distance away from L5. That's the fifth lumbar vertebrae. That's acting potentially as an axis of rotation. So each of these could be thought of as a moment arm. Those moment arms get bigger and bigger as that box gets farther and farther out. The closer to the body we bring that box, the smaller those moment arms are. Even though the box still weighs the same, the difference is we're reducing torque. So as we reduce torque, that takes a lot of stress off the spine. And if we can keep the spine erect or upright, vertical, then that's going to reduce those shear forces as well. So this is a case in biomechanics, again, where you get to have your cake and eat it too. By reducing the torque and reducing those moment arms, you're also reducing the shear force. So lower back injuries usually occur right in here. Either there's pressure, subluxation, that means movement away from where it's supposed to be. For the vertebral discs, you could have a tendon, ligament, or muscle injury. When people say soft tissue, that's what they mean. Tendons, ligaments, muscles, and fascia. So we want to bring that box in. When you're carrying a lot of times when you're grabbing something and you're in a hurry, you can produce a lot of stress on the spine. When people get older and they have vertebral fractures, they're usually in the parts of the spine that have the greatest curvature. That would be right here. That's the lower part of the thoracic region and the upper part. This is the cervical region, this is the thoracic region, and then this is the lumbar region of the spine. Push-ups. A push-up is really, especially if you can do them with your hands in, which will emphasize the triceps more, or you can do them with your hands out, which will emphasize both elbow extension and also horizontal adduction. These are, in the sense, upside down bench presses, or you can think about a bench press as a right side push-up. Let's think about if it's kind of an upside down bench press or a right side up bench press. What type of weight are you working with? What's the resistance? Well, we're going to try to figure it out in this particular problem. So whether it's your knees or whether it's your feet, they're going to act as the axis of rotation. When you do a push-up with your knees, you've reduced the resistance arm to a greater extent than you've reduced the force arm, and that makes it easier. You're going to cut your resistance arm by about 50%, and then your force arm by about 33%. So you're going to win in the end. That ratio of force arm divided by resistance arm is going to increase. If you do the push-up with your feet, then it's going to be a little tougher, but let's see what percentage of our body weight. So I've got a little over half this person's height, acting where the center of gravity is. I've got the distance between their arms, or their shoulders, I should say, where the force is being produced, and the feet. So that's going to be my force arm. So here's my resistance arm. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume an isometric contraction to figure out this problem. So I've got my mass. I've got the mass of the arms, which I took out. I've got the height. I've got where the center of gravity is. I think I've got everything I need to be able to do the problem. So I'm going to assume the down position. I'm going to assume that the back is straight, and so are the legs. If you're doing a good push-up, that this is the case. Harder to do sometimes, especially if you're out of shape or you get a little older, as I've discovered. So I've calculated the weight of the body, took out the arms because they're doing the work. They're not lifting themselves as much as they're lifting the body at the shoulders, if that makes sense, and at the torso. I got the distance from the center of gravity to the feet. That's the force arm. And then this, in a sense, is the resistance arm. So let's say to do the lift, I need to produce at least as much, in fact, more torque than the torque due to the body. So I'm going to solve this as if it were a static equation, but I'm just going to use a greater than sign. So it's a good way to estimate how much force do you need to exceed to be able to do this particular lift. Okay, so I'm going to set up the problem, divide the torque into force, and we're going to assume this is like a moment arm distance. And once I do that, then I can divide both sides by the force arm distance. So it's 156 centimeters. This, by the way, is a second-class lever. We have an axis of rotation. We have a resistance in the middle. We have the motive force on the other side. So the second-class lever, you're thinking, oh, you got leverage. That means you probably are not going to be working with your full weight. It's going to be a portion of it. So let's figure out exactly what that is. When we crunch the numbers out, we get a little over 50% of that person's body weight. So when you do a push-up, it's like working out with a little over 50, 55, percent of your body weight, maybe closer to 60, depending upon your body shape, etc. You can also do this type of calculation when you do a sit-up as well. So it's actually pretty cool that you can use these lever systems to figure out what's going on. But this is a second-class lever. Okay, so weightlifting application really quickly, and then one more. So when you're doing weightlifting, like with the Cybex machine, they're a little unusual in that what's going to happen is you go throughout the range of motion. This lever arm actually doesn't change at all. So you got this contact force. That means you have a constant amount of torque throughout the range of motion. So if that's the case, one of the things you notice is when you get started, it's going to feel really difficult, gets easier in the middle, and then it gets tough at the end. So at the beginning and at the end, it gets really tough. Why is that? So there's a constant torque, so you think a constant resistance, and that's because the muscle joint system doesn't produce a constant amount of torque. It actually produces something like this. Right here. This is the amount of torque that the elbow flexors can produce throughout the range of motion. They're going to peak in the middle, and the amount of torque that they can produce is going to be small on either end. Here we go. Okay, so when you're doing a free weight exercise, it gets interesting because the amount of torque is going to change dramatically. When that forearm, let's say, is horizontal, that's where the maximum amount of torque is going to be. So if you're doing these preacher curls, there's going to be a lot of resistance early in that range of motion. But as you get close to here, it actually gets easier. That can get so easy, the weight's doing work for you in the last part of. So you need to remember that when you're working at that. Sometimes you want to do preacher curls to emphasize the early part of the range of motion. If you have your arms by your side, you're working at kind of the middle of the range of motion. Put your arms behind you, you're working at the range of motion closer to full flexion. Okay, so what is Nautilus and what do machines that use a cam design, what are they trying to do? Well, they're going to change the moment arm as you move through the range of motion. As you go from full extension towards full flexion, that cam changes, and therefore the distance between where the chain comes off the cam and the axis of rotation, that's going to change. It's actually going to get larger in the middle of the range of motion and smaller on either end. So what is it trying to do in the blue dots here? It's trying to emulate that muscle joint system. So this curve is going to be different for every muscle joint system. And that's kind of the tough thing about Nautilus designs. I think there's only so many of them. And they didn't research every single muscle joint system because that would be challenging, very challenging work. Worthwhile though. I know they have a pretty good back machine, and they have machines for shoulders and bench press and a lot of different stuff. And you just have to keep in mind when you're using a free weight, depending upon, in this case, it's a kind of a preacher curl, where you're emphasizing the close to full extension part of the range of motion. And notice when you get, notice the torque goes below zero. The gravity's doing the work for you once you get closer to full flexion. So there's some advantages and disadvantages to Nautilus machines. The way they work is that you have to be able to go, you can go through full range of motion. You can emphasize the entire range of motion, but you have to do it kind of slowly. So if you're emphasizing things like power, etc. But in terms of crossing the threshold where you want to increase protein synthesis, and that's about 70% of a 1 rep max, that means you're probably doing about 8 to 12 repetitions. It's not so bad. Not so bad at all. Okay, stability. It's kind of the last application I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to refer to some extra practice problems that you guys can do. Torque applications. Stability. Well, we're going to talk about a base. And so you probably know in a lot of sports, you want that wider base. And it doesn't really matter whether it's golf or tennis or wrestling or football or basketball, like you're a defender. You get that wide base, it's harder to push someone off that base. Why is that? Well, if you have a narrow base and you have a force that's away from what's now an axis of rotation, it's easy to produce torque on that person and knock them over. That's bad, bad news. So a wider base, there you go, turn that frown upside down. Wider base is going to make you a lot more stable because now you actually have static friction working in your favor, resisting against the torque being produced by that force away from an axis of rotation. And with a wide base, technically as you're pushing over, that axis of rotation is now over here as opposed to being very close to your center of gravity. So this is like having a large sweet spot or moment of inertia. It's going to resist against that torque being produced by that off-center force, meaning the force away from the axis of rotation. Okay, so that's it for some of our additional applications. So on slide set 16C, there's some additional problems and examples you can work through. We have some examples with free weights where we're going to be calculating the amount of torque. So go through these practice problems. Here we see the torque given a certain moment arm. Have some examples. These were originally from Susan Hall's text. That's actually a pretty good bestseller. We used to use it a lot, but it's kind of fallen behind the literature, especially in connective tissue mechanics. And that's where a lot of the hot research is going on. And that's where sports medicine is really focused on today, trying to maximize healing of those tissues, especially after an injury. So here's some orientation with horizontal, principle of moments again, multi-segmented movement. If you think about the principle of moments, that's what you need to be able to solve these problems. You simply add the torques together. And that's what we're doing in this particular problem. And here's another one, multi-segmented movement. And it just looks at two examples. When you flex the elbow, maybe you're holding like a shot put and bringing it closer in, you're going to be reducing that moment of inertia. You're reducing also the moment arm, which reduces the amount of torque that you have to overcome, which makes it easier to rotate. So I think that's it in terms of torque applications. When you see me again, we're going to be talking about pressure applications. That'll be the next step, under pressure. So I want you guys to have a really good one. Think about we. Protect yourself at all times. Keep your masks ready. Everybody be safe. And hope to see you guys again really, really soon. In fact, I can guarantee it. All right. Take care.